out that nobody understands exactly why, but he was stalking them, he was hunting them.
The maximum penalty for that offense, if you plead guilty or are found guilty, is up to death and/or imprisonment for life. Do you understand?
Yes.
This was probably a person that blends into the background.
Yeah, from Pennsylvania. We actually don't have crosswalks.
His neighbors and people who know him superficially would probably never guess that he had any violent tendencies.
It's disgusting to think about someone that you used to hang out with all the time could do something like this.
Are you waiving your right to a speedy preliminary hearing?
Yes.
If you got to know him well, you would see layers of things that were a bit off or different.
What I do know is that Bryan did have anger issues.
You could tell there was some off about him. Very quiet, calculated about what he says. Actually very similar to how he walked into court, no different.
I'm just curious about the law. I don't mean to...
Oh, no, yeah, I can find it for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Everything that I've read about BRYAN KOHBERGER would fit the type of person that we would expect for doing a crime like this.
All right, we've got some news tonight, some new information released, and this is the information that prosecutors are attempting to get or have received, but is now under seal. But we've got what the requests are from their warrant. First, Amazon data. Take a look. All detailed customer click activity pertaining to knives and accessories. All details of items in carts, to include all items added to the cart, all items removed or deleted from the cart, and all items saved in the cart, wish listed or shopping baskets. They want to know what the accused killer was shopping for on Amazon. Next one, very interesting. Spotify, search queries, streaming history, playlists, user library, browsing history, account settings, interactions with other Spotify users, user third-party services, devices, and applications in connection with the Spotify service. Next one is even more interesting, related to Spotify. User device sensor data to include motion-generated or orientation-generated device sensor data. Had no idea that Spotify did this, which the user device collects about the way the user moves or holds their device. Okay, from Apple, the contents of all emails associated with the account, including stored or preserved copies of emails sent to and from the account. The contents of all instant messages associated with the account, including stored or preserved copies of instant messages, including iMessages, SMS messages, and MMS messages sent to and from the account, including all draft and deleted messages. And don't forget, folks, this is on the docket, motion to dismiss. It's a big, big hearing, October 26th. And of course, we will be covering that for you right here on Court TV and Closing Arguments. Let's bring back in our think tank, Bernardo Villalona, Lori Murray, Ian Friedman. Ian, this is a case where no murder weapon's been recovered. We do not believe any bloody clothing has been recovered either. We're not sure what, if any, evidence was even recovered from the white Hyundai Elantra. So in light of that, and the fact that the key piece of evidence is some DNA from a knife sheath from this button snap up on top as the key, really, to place him at the scene, the knife sheath that was found beneath the victims' bodies. How important is this search history and this internet history, Amazon, Spotify, Apple?
I think it's critical. I mean, this is a case that technology is going to help make. I think here they've got the sheath, as you said. If there's a knife that was ordered by Amazon that fits that sheath, game over. Because that one, as a defense counsel, that's going to be really tough to get around. Now you add to it all of the movements that put him in that place, search terms that are talking about it, order histories and so forth. It's going to be a problem if all that adds up. But if that knife was ordered on Amazon, or if they're able to prove it anyway, that he had the knife that fit that sheath, and this getting around the sheath by itself with his DNA there is tough enough. But they put that knife on order to him. Good night.
Lori Murray, you can learn a lot about defendants these days, right? From the digital footprint, from what we're doing, what we're saying. In this case, they need as much as possible, right? This defense, it's going to be a death penalty case. The defense is fighting every issue as hard as they can. They're incredibly competent, the defense in this case. What are your thoughts about this information, this data from Amazon, Spotify, Apple?
Well, I thought that their requests were very thorough, and I was impressed by the thoroughness of it. First of all, let's talk about Apple. I don't think that they're going to find that many text messages on there because I don't think he had any friends. So you might have some emails that are, spam emails, but I don't think he had a whole lot of social interaction with anybody. So Apple, you're probably not going to get much from. Spotify is interesting to me. I didn't know they kept that data either. I'm going to have to watch my Spotify. But, I guess they're going to look for whether he was near the crime scene with the Spotify, whether his phone was, and what orientation it was. But I think you can get that same data from Apple. So that's a little bit odd to me. But they want to hear whether he's watching shows like How to Get Away with Murder or listening to true crime podcasts and, all of these, maybe they're all stabbing deaths that he's listening to about on podcasts. But the most interesting one for me is the Amazon one, as it should be to everybody, because they're not only asking for this particular knife, maybe they find that he got the knife there. Maybe they find it, that is a huge magic gift that Amazon would give them. But what if he was just looking for knives? What if he just shopped around and clicked, and they asked for the clicks, not just what he bought, but what they clicked, so they actually look at all of the things, and he clicked on 17 different knives that were like this one, and then went and bought it from the local store so as not to have the record of it. He's still caught. And so I think that's a really good search and a really good subpoena on behalf of the state.
On October 25th, 2023, the court issued an order addressing IgG DNA and order for in-camera review that addressed the state's motion to prevent the disclosure of the investigative genetic genealogy information to the defense and the defense's motion to compel discovery of all information pertaining to the IgG investigation. On November 30th, 2023, the state submitted to the court in camera all IgG information pertaining to the state's investigation from both the FBI and a private laboratory. The court has now completed its review, and the information provided by the state and orders the state to discover to the defense a portion of the IgG information. The specific material to be provided is set forth in a sealed order to protect the privacy of the IgG information, including individuals on the family tree, dated 11th day of January, signed by John C. Judge.
25 News investigation connected to the arrest of the man charged with murdering 4 University of Idaho college students, specifically the method used by Idaho police involving DNA and genealogy to find their suspect, BRYAN KOHBERGER.
Police didn't mention it at all in the arrest affidavit, so some think, well, that's just a rumor. It didn't really happen.
But through exclusive sources, our investigative reporter Terry Parker learned it did happen, and it was crucial to this case. Terry?
Right. I'm going to explain how police use genetic genealogy in this murder case that has gripped the nation, how it works, and why this Idaho case may change the nature of crime solving forever. When Moscow detectives entered the horrifying crime scene where 4 university students were found mysteriously stabbed to death November 13th, they discovered a major clue. A K-bar knife sheath laying on the bed next to one of the bodies. But the DNA they found on that sheath led them nowhere at first, because not a single match came up on the National Criminal DNA Database. So whose DNA was it? That's when investigators came up with a novel idea that up until now was typically used only in cold cases. They sent the DNA to a private lab to see if they could find a match on a public ancestry database. And it worked.
Genetic genealogy was crucial in identifying the defendant in the Idaho murder case.
According to a source close to the investigation, the private lab entered the DNA into a public ancestry database, and within days, cousin matches were showing up. Genealogists start the tree with the closest cousin they can.
We use tools such as Ancestry.com to help build those trees. So once you get this individual's name, you can start building their family tree. records.
Meantime, detectives were still looking for other clues, and they got a big one. Surveillance cameras caught a white Hyundai Elantra driving around the crime scene at the time of the murders. On November 25th, police asked other law enforcement to be on the lookout for white Elantras. And 4 days later, Washington State University police say they found one, registered to BRYAN KOHBERGER. But did that name mean anything to police at the time? Apparently not, because police made a public plea for information about white Elantras on December 7th. Then they began sorting through over 22,000 registered Elantras. It was the proverbial needle in a haystack. And that's where genetic genealogy became so crucial. My source says within days, the lab handed over the tree leading to the KOHBERGER family and their only son, Bryan, who drives a white Elantra.
And now you find out that he's living less than 10 miles away. You've got a prime suspect.
Detectives get search warrants for KOHBERGER's phone and start tracking him. He drives home to Pennsylvania with his father for Christmas, and agents retrieve some of the family's trash. They run DNA on it and find KOHBERGER's father, Michael, is likely to be the father of whoever left the DNA on the knife sheath. They arrest BRYAN KOHBERGER the next day.
Now, with such a high-profile case, I think that police departments all across the country are going to want to try to follow the lead in Idaho because it's incredibly powerful.
Rapid results in a baffling case that could have taken months to solve or even gone cold. Retired FBI agent John McVeigh says this tool could change crime solving forever and should have a chilling effect on criminals.
Because you never know when they're going to knock on your door that, hey, we got a match.
And you might wonder why there is no mention of the genetic genealogy in the probable cause affidavit. Well, that's for two reasons. One, police don't need to include every lead they get that brings them to their suspect, just enough to convince a judge to sign the arrest warrant. And two, law enforcement has been divided on whether revealing this information might lead to people being reluctant to sign up for ancestry databases if they think it might be used to solve criminal cases. But the experts I talked to say that ship has sailed, and many people don't care if their DNA eventually helps find and convict a distantly related killer.
In this video, we will demonstrate DNA extraction from blood using the KIA-AMP DNA Mini and Blood Mini kit.
The DNA extraction will be carried out in duplicate on a single blood sample. Please note that blood sample collection should always be performed by a phlebotomist.
Before starting your DNA extraction, ensure that the area where this is being carried out is clean and has been decontaminated. This can be done by spraying the bench, pipettes, and equipment to be used with freshly made 10% bleach solution. Allow this to sit for 15 to 30 minutes and then wipe away any residual bleach, followed by rinsing with clean water and finally spraying with 70% ethanol. Gloves are to be worn at all times throughout the extraction process and change frequently, especially if coming into contact with other surfaces that might be contaminated. Also check that all equipment and consumables you are going to use are in place and that the buffers in the kit have been prepared. For example, the appropriate volumes of ethanol have been added to buffers AW1 and AW2. Your heating block must have been set at 56 degrees centigrade and ready to use.
Before commencing with DNA extraction, please ensure to familiarize yourself with the protocol.
So you have prepared the area where you will be carrying out your extractions, and you will begin by labeling the microtubes with sample IDs using a permanent marker. We label the sides of our tubes as well in case ethanol comes into contact with the microtube lids.
Mix the blood by inverting the tube approximately 10 times to ensure you have a homogeneous sample.
Vortex the proteinase K briefly, followed by a quick centrifugation step, approximately 10 seconds. Pipette 20 microliters of proteinase K into each microtube. Pipette 200 microliters of blood into each tube. Do this slowly as blood is viscous. Cap the blood sample and put to one side. Add 200 microliters of buffer AL to each sample. Close the tube and vortex for about 15 seconds, and this step will be repeated for all subsequent samples. Transfer the microtubes to the heating block that has been set at 56 degrees centigrade and incubate the samples for 10 minutes. At the end of the incubation period, remove the samples from the heating block and briefly centrifuge to remove any droplets from the lids. Add 200 microliters of absolute ethanol to each microtube and mix each sample by briefly pulse vortexing for about 15 seconds. Briefly centrifuge the microtubes. Prepare a mini spin column for each sample. Label your spin columns, ensuring that each spin column corresponds to the sample ID. We usually label the sides of the spin columns as well, in case the ID on the lid is smudged by ethanol. Carefully transfer the mixture from the previous step to the spin column, taking care not to wet the rim of the spin column. And this is repeated with all subsequent samples. Close the spin column and centrifuge at 6000 G, that's about 8000 RPM, for 1 minute. At the end of the centrifugation period, all the filtrate should be in the collection tube.
Transfer the spin columns, which now contain the DNA, to clean collection tubes and discard the collection tubes containing the lysate.
Carefully open the spin column and add 500 microliters of AW1 buffer, taking care not to wet the rim. Remember to change your tip between each sample. Close the caps and return the samples to the centrifuge. And centrifuge for 1 minute again at 6000 G, that is 8000 RPM. At the end of the centrifugation period, check that all the filtrate is in the collection tube. If there is still some in the spin column, just repeat that centrifugation step. Discard the collection tube and transfer the spin columns to clean collection tubes. Carefully open the lid and add 500 microliters of AW2 without wetting the rim of the spin columns. Close the cap and centrifuge at full speed. That's 20,000 G, around 14,000 RPM for 3 minutes. Discard the filtrate from the collection tube into a waste container, as the collection tube is going to be reused. Dry the rim of each collection tube on a paper towel and replace the spin column.
Centrifuge at full speed for 1 minute. This ensures that all residual wash buffer and ethanol are removed, which could affect downstream processes.
Label clean 1.5 ml microtubes, one for each sample, and transfer the spin columns to each corresponding microtube.
The DNA that was on the spin column will be eluted from the column to the AE buffer.
Add 200 microliters of AE buffer to each spin column, remembering to change tips between samples. Incubate for 1 minute at room temperature. Centrifuge for 1 minute at 6000 G, that's 8000 RPM. Of DNA at ambient temperature. This needs to be performed in a PCR hood or a laminar flow. Turn on the PCR hood or laminar flow at least 5 minutes before starting. Aliquot the same volume of DNA across the plate. The positions of each DNA sample has to be recorded accurately using a sample recording template containing a plate layout. The plate will remain in the PCR hood or the laminar flow until the samples have dried down completely. The drying time will depend on the volume of DNA used. Approximate drying times can be found in the DNA stable protocol. However, the drying time should be monitored and the final time recorded. The PCR hood or laminar flow should be kept running for the duration of the drying down time. When all the DNA plates are completely dried down, seal the plate with a PCR plate seal, ensuring that all wells are completely airtight. This can be achieved by using a seal applicator. Close the plate. Each plate has a lid, and place a DNA stable plate into a shipping bag. Place the bag and accompanying documentation, for example, the sample submission forms, export license details, into a shipping box.
And traits of serial killers. A serial killer is usually someone who murders 3 or more people. They are often abused as children, and the abuse is usually by a family member. It is important to note that the abuse can be emotional, physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. They are often sadistic and tend to want to harm small animals. Serial killers often resent their parents. They are unemployed or struggle to keep a job. A history of bedwetting over the age of 5, usually until the age of around 12. They are often very intelligent with high IQ. Many have intense interest in sadomasochistic pornography. Their families almost always have a history of criminal behavior, alcohol or substance abuse. A fascination with fires or starting a fire. They usually demonstrate antisocial behavior. They tend to come from unstable families. As a child, they were most likely abandoned by their father and raised by a domineering single mother. There is usually a high rate of suicide attempts. It is more common with white males, usually very average looking, single or divorced and in their 20s or 30s. It is also important to note that many serial killers, after being evaluated, have suffered from some sort of severe head injury or head trauma.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, I was, just like sleeping here on the couch in my parents' house, and I woke up to all these tweets that were like, "Oh, they got the guy." And of course, this has been something that everyone in Pullman has been following, everyone in the whole Pullman Moscow area. And so, I look on my phone and I see the guy's name and I see the picture, and I'm thinking that looks a lot like my TA who's also named Brian, but that would be crazy. And so I went and I checked my email, to see the emails I'd had with him, and the name matched and everything. And yeah, it was just like totally jarring, totally shocking to realize that this person that had been, kind of grading my papers was, allegedly this like horrible murderer. Yeah, no, entirely. All our interactions came in the form of the class, and not even like office hours. Like it was all within the confines of a lecture hall. He was pretty strict as far as grading goes. When he came into class, he was very, not super mentally present. He would stand up at the front, look at the ground. He had a lot of like boilerplate responses he would give people rather than, maybe something he had thought up on the spot. It seemed like he would be, he'd come in knowing what he was going to say to like most interactions. And then when he would grade your papers, he would be grading you on what he ended up calling like a higher standard. But what it really felt like to us was he was grading us like he would have graded himself as a PhD student. And so that was just kind of like, we were all annoyed by him. And so I knew his name, I knew like, oh, TA Brian, like he's kind of, he sucks at this. Like he's grading us too harshly. And that was like an annoyance. But obviously beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird and kind of, a bad grader. Yeah. He actually only left me good comments, which is just kind of silly. Like the only ones I could send in were nice ones, but for most people, he was being pretty harsh in the comments. I just, for whatever reason, he was being pretty good to me. Yeah, actually, we had our professor was big on the idea that like if we're all going to be attorneys someday, then we have to know how to argue our case. And so he scheduled a day where everyone came in ready to argue to get their grades up. And he brought in Brian, and he was like, "All right, go at him." And he had Brian stand up, and everyone was like a few people were on his side because they wanted to keep their high grades and not like have questions be cut out or whatever. But for the most part, it was like, half of a 150 person class just asking him all these real critical questions, and he would answer. And he'd actually, he tried pretty hard to defend himself, which was the kind of thing that our professor loved. He wanted the like courtroom environment. And so there was just a period of class where we were all sort of arguing about this. Not, I mean, it wasn't like yelling or anything, but it was certainly conflict. Yeah, yeah. We just, it would have been about a month before winter break when like the murders happened. And we didn't obviously build our framework for this around that because we had no reason to connect him to that, at the time. But definitely around then, um, he started grading everybody just hundreds, not like you pretty much if you turned something in, you were getting high marks, and he stopped leaving notes. It was just, he seemed preoccupied, is what I would have said at the time. And now, obviously, he seems like he was probably pretty preoccupied. But it was, yeah, it was much easier. You'd turn in whatever you wanted, pretty much, and he was just grading them up and sending them back. Like, yeah, yeah, absolutely. He probably that I saw he was always a little bit spotty on whether or not he'd come to class because he had whatever PhD stuff over the top of it. But the couple times that he did come after or around that time period, I remember him. He had like a little bit more facial hair, just like stubble, but definitely less like well kept than he was, and he was a little quieter. He didn't. He used to stand up at the start of class and like talk about some stuff sometimes, and this time he didn't really do that at all. He was definitely, I think, like the previous like mental preoccupation that we had been noticing, where it was like, he didn't really want to be there. That was at like an all-time high, and he just, didn't look like he was doing great.